In 1980, the most expensive racing motorcycles on the planet gathered at a dusty hillside track in Southern California for the biggest motocross race of the year. Factory Honda, Suzuki, Kawasaki, and Yamaha had each poured millions into building hand-machined prototype machines packed with magnesium and titanium, ridden by the fastest men alive. These bikes could not be bought at any price. They were engineering projects with handlebars bolted on, and the factories guarded them like military secrets. But when the dust settled that afternoon at Carlsbad Raceway, every single one of those machines had been beaten. Not by another factory team, not by some secret prototype nobody saw coming. They were beaten by a 23-year-old privateer riding a near-stock Yamaha that any weekend rider could buy at a dealership for under $2,000. Millions of people watched it happen on national television. This is the story of Marty Moates and the single greatest upset in motocross history. To understand why this race mattered so much, you need to understand what Carlsbad meant to the sport. The United States Grand Prix of motocross at Carlsbad Raceway had been running since 1973, and by the end of the decade, it had become something close to a national event. ABC's Wide World of Sports, the most prestigious sports broadcast platform in America at the time, featured the race for a nationwide audience. Jim Lampley called the action to a coast-to-coast audience. And on race day, somewhere between 20 and 35,000 fans packed the sun-scorched hillsides of what locals called the Rock. The track itself was carved into steep, sandy terrain overlooking the Pacific coast near San Diego. The dirt baked to a hard-packed blue groove surface under the June sun. Ruts formed like concrete trenches. The famous Carlsbad jump launched riders high enough that the crowd could see them silhouetted against the sky. It was beautiful, it was brutal, and for 9 straight years it had belonged to the Europeans. Gerrit Wolsink, a Dutch rider they called the Flying Dentist because he practiced dentistry in the off-season, had won 5 of those 9 races. Roger de Coster, a 5-time 500 cubic centimeter world champion from Belgium, riding factory Suzukis, had famously said of the place that he was doomed there. In 9 runnings of the race, no American had ever won the overall. Jim Pomeroy came closest in 1977, winning Moto 1 before crashing out of the second. That was it. The Europeans owned this track, and every year the Americans left frustrated. Fans were calling Carlsbad the Woodstock of motorcycle racing. It had that kind of energy. Tens of thousands of people camped out overnight, partied on the hillsides, waved American flags, and waited desperately for the year an American would finally break through. 1980 felt like it might be the year. The race was the 7th round of the 12-round FYM 500 cubic centimeter motocross world championship, and the title fight was intense. André Malherbe, a Belgian rider on a factory Honda RC500, led the championship standings. Right behind him was Brad Lackey, the top American hope, aboard a full factory Kawasaki SR500. Lackey was hungry. He had been chasing the world championship for years, and the Carlsbad round was his home turf advantage. Behind those two sat a murderer's row of factory-backed talent from across Europe and America. Håkan Karlqvist, the reigning 250 cubic centimeter world champion from Sweden, was there on a factory Yamaha OW prototype. Danny Laporte, a rising American star, rode a works Suzuki RA with the brand new full-floater monoshock suspension, a piece of technology so advanced it would not reach consumer bikes for years. And Roger de Coster himself, the living legend, the man with 5 world championships, was on yet another factory Suzuki. All the major motocross manufacturers were represented in this race. Major names and major machines. And this is where the money part of the story gets truly wild. The Factory Works bikes of 1980 were not motorcycles you could buy at a dealership, not at any price. They were hand-built, one-of-a-kind racing prototypes that looked like production bikes the way a fighter jet looks like a single-engine Cessna. Same general shape, completely different machine underneath. Honda's RC500, for example, was machined from magnesium and titanium inside the HRC factory in Japan by dedicated race engineers. The crankcases, the cylinder, the hubs, even the axles were custom fabricated. Parts that would be cast steel on a showroom bike were precision milled from exotic alloys on a works machine. Suzuki's RA series featured prototype monoshock suspension systems and experimental engine porting that factory technicians spent months perfecting for each individual rider. Kawasaki's SR500 came out of a dedicated factory race department with an essentially unlimited engineering budget. How much did these things actually cost? The manufacturers never published exact numbers because honestly the numbers were embarrassing. Honda and the other major manufacturers were pouring enormous sums into their global racing programs, with dedicated engineers, test facilities, and factory race departments working year-round. Suzuki, Kawasaki, and Yamaha each ran their own multi-million-dollar programs with teams of engineers who did nothing but develop racing motorcycles. These were not machines that existed on any price list. Each one was a prototype built for a single rider, tuned to that rider's weight, riding style, and track preferences. When a works bike broke at a race, the factory mechanic did not order a replacement part from a warehouse. They could have custom replacements sourced directly from the factory for the next round. Genuine factory works motocross bikes from the early 1980s now sell at collector auctions through houses like Bonham's and Mecum for $30,000 to well over $100,000. And that's 45 years later, bought as display pieces. At the time they were built, each one represented the cutting edge of what a motorcycle manufacturer could engineer when money was no object. The gap between a factory rider and a privateer in 1980 was not just about talent. It was about resources. A factory rider showed up to the race with a semi-truck full of spare engines, a pit crew of 6 to 8 dedicated mechanics, a motorhome, factory-paid travel, and a salary. A privateer like Moates showed up with a van, one bike, maybe one spare engine, and a buddy who knew how to turn a wrench. Now picture the opposite end of that spectrum. Marty Moates was born on December 10, 1956 in San Diego, California, just a short ride from Carlsbad Raceway. He grew up watching motocross races at that same track as a kid, pressing his face against the chain-link fence and dreaming about the day he might ride there himself. San Diego was a hotbed of motocross talent in the 70s. Riders like Marty Tripes, Brock Glover, Rick Johnson, and Marty Smith all came out of what people called the El Cajon Zone, a pocket of Southern California that produced an absurd concentration of world-class dirt bike riders. Moates was part of that scene. By his late teens, he was talented enough to race professionally, but talent and money are two completely different currencies in motorsport, and Moates had plenty of one and almost none of the other. In the late 1970s, he took a shot at the European Grand Prix circuit, racing ill-handling awesome machines on the 250cc World Championship Tour. The results were ugly. The bikes broke constantly, the injuries piled up, and after a couple of brutal seasons, he came home to San Diego, essentially broke and beaten up. The motocross press had basically written him off. At 23 years old, in a sport that chewed through riders like bubblegum, Marty Moates was considered over the hill. A journeyman privateer living hand-to-mouth, scraping together enough money to keep racing because he didn't know how to do anything else. But then, a small, newly formed team called Yamaha offered him a ride for the 1980 season. stood for Lorenz Offner Products, and calling them a team was generous. They were a shoestring operation running on passion and pocket change compared to the factory squads they would be lining up against. They operated without direct factory team support from Yamaha. They had no engineering department. They had heart, some mechanical knowledge, and a belief that their rider had something the stopwatch could not measure. The bike they gave Moates was a 1980 Yamaha YZ465G. This is where the David versus Goliath math gets absolutely ridiculous. The YZ465G was an over-the-counter, production air-cooled two-stroke motocrosser. A 465cc long-stroke engine in a standard steel frame with conventional suspension. You could walk into any Yamaha dealership in America and ride one out the door for roughly $1,800. Motocross Action magazine rated it the best open-class production bike of 1980, which was genuine praise. Cycle World described Moates' version as a nearly stock production YZ465G. Motorcycle Classics later called it a rather pedestrian customer bike. Production Bike of the Year is a real compliment, but Best Production Bike and competitive against factory prototypes are two completely different conversations. The gap between a showroom YZ465 and a factory Yamaha OW41 works. Bike was like the gap between a Honda Civic and a purpose-built Le Mans race car. Same number of wheels, completely different species. Moates and the LOP crew did what every privateer team does. They fettled the suspension with aftermarket Bilstein and Fox components. They dialed in the jetting for Carlsbad's altitude and temperature. They put fresh graphics on the side panels and made the bike as competitive as a production machine could be. It was well prepared, it was professionally maintained, it was absolutely categorically not a factory race machine. So picture this, June 22nd, 1980, the starting gate at Carlsbad Raceway, a BC cameras rolling from multiple angles, the helicopter thumping overhead for aerial shots, Jim Lampley in the commentary booth preparing to broadcast to millions of living rooms across America, 30,000 fans packed into every square foot of the hillsides, many shirtless and sunburned, having camped overnight to claim their spot, American flags everywhere, the smell of two-stroke exhaust mixing with sunscreen and spilled beer. This was as big as motocross got in America. The tension in the staging area was electric. Every factory team had its own canopy, its own pit crew in matching uniforms, its own truck stocked with spare engines and parts. The factory mechanics performed final checks on their priceless prototypes like surgeons preparing for an operation. Each works bike had been flown in from Japan or Europe specifically for this event, hand-carried off cargo planes in padded crates. On one side of the gate, you had Andre Malherbe on his prototype Honda RC500 worth more than some houses. Brad Lackey on his factory Kawasaki SR500 chasing a world championship. Håkan Karlqvist on a factory Yamaha OW41. Danny Laporte on a works Suzuki RA with that prototype full-floater rear end. Roger DeCoster, five-time world champion on another works Suzuki. Andre Vromans on a factory Yamaha, Gerard Rond on a factory Suzuki, Rex Staton on a factory Yamaha, a dozen more factory-supported riders from around the globe. And then there was Marty Moates on his $1,800 Yamaha from the local dealership. Few riders in that starting gate gave him a second look. Here is a detail that tells you everything about what kind of racer Moates was. During practice, he noticed that the concrete starting pad was dangerously slippery. The factory riders had mechanics fine-tuning their suspension settings and adjusting their prototype clutch mechanisms. Moates grabbed a handful of dirt and sprinkled it across the concrete pad for better traction. No engineer told him to do that. No team manager suggested it. He just saw a problem and solved it, because when you do not have a $100,000 machine under you, you better be smarter than everyone else on the line. The gate dropped for Moto 1, and Moates launched off that dirt-covered pad and got the whole shot. That means he reached the first corner ahead of every single factory rider on the track, on his production Yamaha, against the entire 500cc World Championship field. The ABC commentary booth audibly did not know who he was. The crowd could see the American flag on his jersey, but the question in the announcer's mind was obvious. Marty who? What factory does he ride for? Wait, he is a privateer? On a stock bike? By the end of lap 3, Moates had stretched a gap of nearly 10 seconds. 10 seconds in motocross is an eternity. The factory riders watched his rear fender disappear over the hills. DeCoster, the five-time world champion, crashed hard on the downhill section and was knocked unconscious, ending his entire day. The armada of factory machinery was falling apart behind the kid on the stock Yamaha. Then Moates made a mistake. He went down in a slippery corner and dropped to third behind Karlqvist on his factory Yamaha OW and Laporte on his prototype Suzuki. This was the moment everyone expected reality to reassert itself. The factory bikes would recover their natural order. The privateer's fairy tale would come to its inevitable end. But Moates remounted, caught Karlqvist, and passed him. Laporte then took the lead from Karlqvist, but his Suzuki began having shifting problems under the stress of racing. Moates caught the struggling factory Suzuki, made the pass for the lead, and pulled away. He won Moto 1 on a production motorcycle against the factory 500 cubic centimeter World Championship field, and he did it on national television. Waving to the crowd, he sailed over the Carlsbad jump on the final lap. 30,000 fans at Carlsbad erupted. But here is the thing about motocross Grand Prix racing. You have to do it twice. The overall winner is determined by combined results across two motos, and every factory team manager on that hillside spent the intermission frantically strategizing how to put this privateer back in his place for the second moto. Fresh tires, revised suspension settings, new gear ratios. The factories had all the tools, all the manpower, and all the motivation in the world to make sure the second moto went differently. Meanwhile, Moates and his LOP crew were doing what privateers do during an intermission, checking the chain tension, topping off the gas, and trying not to think too hard about what just happened. Moto 2. The gate dropped again, but this time, championship leader Andre Malherbe never even made it off the line. His factory Honda blew its transmission right there on the starting pad. The most expensive bike in the field was done for the day before the first corner. Moates hole shot again. For the second time that afternoon, the cheapest motorcycle on the starting line reached the first corner before every factory prototype behind it. The crowd at Carlsbad went absolutely berserk. But Lackey wasn't done. Desperate for championship points, he charged through the field and caught Moates. Then he passed him on the big downhill, briefly taking the lead. For one lap, the factory order seemed restored. Moates tucked in behind Lackey, studying his lines, watching where the factory Kawasaki was fast and where it was vulnerable. Then Moates made his move. Lackey went too deep into a corner at almost the same moment, lost the front end of his factory Kawasaki, and slid under a chain link fence bordering the track. It took him 2 full laps to extract himself and his mangled machine from the fence. Moates was alone at the front, and this time, nobody caught him. Lap after lap, the San Diego kid on the stock Yamaha put clean air between himself and the rest of the field. His lines through the blue groove corners were clean and precise. His body position over the Carlsbad jumps was textbook. He was riding the race of his life, and everyone watching knew they were witnessing something that would never happen again. Moates crossed the finish line first in Moto 2. He pumped his fist in the air as he came over the final jump. A perfect one and one sweep. Both motos won outright. The greatest upset in motocross history was complete. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. 30,000 spectators waved small American flags as Moates did his cool-down lap. The ABC broadcast captured the whole scene, and the footage survives today on the Internet Archive. Jim Lampley's commentary conveyed the disbelief that everyone in the stadium was feeling. Moates, talking to the Los Angeles Times afterward, kept it simple. He said he kept thinking out on the track that he could not believe it was happening. He said Carlsbad was the first race he ever came to as a kid. He had dreamed about this race every single year. The final overall standings told the full story. Moates, first overall, with a perfect 1-1 score. Danny Laporte, second on his works Suzuki, with 3-3. Andre Vromans, third on his factory Yamaha with 4-6. Chuck Sun, fourth. Jim Gibson, fifth. Lackey, Malherbe, Staton, DeCoster, the entire factory. A-list, nowhere near the podium. David Bailey, who would go on to become an American motocross legend, said years later that Moates shocked everyone that day. Everyone except the people who knew him best. Chuck Sun, who became the second American to win Carlsbad the following year in 1981, admitted in Motocross Action that he was surprised Moates was the one who finally broke through. He noted that Brad Lackey was probably the most frustrated person on the planet that afternoon. Yeah, imagine training your entire career for a moment like this, riding a purpose-built factory prototype that cost more than a nice house and getting swept by a guy on a bike any weekend warrior could buy from a dealer showroom. That is a special kind of defeat. But what happened after Moates' victory might be even more significant than the race itself. His win set off a chain reaction that reshaped the entire sport of motocross. First, no European rider ever won the Carlsbad United States Grand Prix again before the track closed in 1986. Chuck Sun won in 1981, Danny Chandler won in 1982, Brock Glover won in 1984, David Bailey won in 1985, Rick Johnson won in 1986. Americans owned Carlsbad from that day forward until the track closed for good after the 1986 race. Second, American riders started dominating the international stage everywhere. Within 2 years of Carlsbad, Brad Lackey became the first American to win the 500 cubic centimeter Motocross World Championship in 1982. Danny Laporte captured the 250 cubic centimeter world title. And in 1981, Team USA returned to the Motocross des Nations, the World Cup of Motocross, and won. They kept winning for 13 consecutive years. The era of American motocross dominance can be traced directly back to this moment at Carlsbad, when a privateer proved that American riders could compete with anyone on anything. Third, and this is the big one, the governing body took action on the works bike problem. In 1984, the American Motorcyclist Association announced that starting with the 1986 season, all AMA Pro, motocross, and supercross competitors would be required to race on production-based motorcycles. The Factory Works bike, that $100,000 engineering marvel, was officially dead in American professional racing. Now, it is worth being honest about the connection here. The AMA production rule was not a direct reaction to Moates' Carlsbad win. The conversation about the absurd cost gap between factory and privateer teams had been building throughout the late 70s and early 80s. Factory budgets were spiraling out of control, and fewer privateers could compete at all. The rule was going to happen eventually. But Moates' victory became the single most visible piece of evidence in that debate. You simply could not argue that production bikes could not compete at the highest level when a nationwide television audience had just watched one sweep the entire factory field at a World Championship event. Today, Racer X, Cycle World, and Motocross Action all cite the 1986 production rule as one of the most consequential rule changes in the history of the sport. It leveled the playing field, made racing more competitive, and opened the door for talented riders who could not afford factory backing. As for Moates himself, his story after Carlsbad did not follow the Hollywood script. He never won at that level again. He went back to being a journeyman privateer, racing wherever he could find a ride and a paycheck. He spent several seasons competing in Australia, including a memorable Mr. Motocross battle in 1983, where he became a fan favorite on the Australian circuit. He won races down there, earned respect from a whole new generation of fans. But the factory contract from Honda or Suzuki or Kawasaki never materialized. The one day of magic at Carlsbad remained exactly that, one incredible, unrepeatable day. And maybe that is part of what makes this story so compelling. Moates was not a factory superstar who won 20 titles. He was a regular guy, a privateer from San Diego, who rose to the absolute occasion on the biggest day of his sport and then went back to being a privateer afterward. The fairy tale did not have a sequel, it did not need one. Later in life, Moates channeled his energy into business. He became a co-founder of the No Fear apparel brand, which grew into a globally recognized action sports label. And in a twist of perfect irony, No Fear was based in Carlsbad, California, the same town where he had pulled off the impossible. In 2010, filmmaker Todd Huffman released a documentary called The Carlsbad USGP 1980, subtitled One Day of Magic. The film features on-camera interviews with Brad Lackey, Roger DeCoster, Bob Hanna, David Bailey, Brock Glover, Rick Johnson, Danny Laporte, and others, all reflecting on what Moates accomplished that June afternoon. The original ABC Wide World of Sports broadcast footage is woven throughout. If you are a motocross fan and you have not seen it, stop what you are doing after this video and go find it. Sadly, Marty Moates died on December 7, 2006, at the age of 49. Friends and fellow riders attributed his struggles in later years in part to chronic pain from old racing injuries sustained across decades of professional motocross. The community mourned deeply. Motocross Action, Racer X, and Dirt Bike Magazine all ran tributes to a man who had given them the single most unforgettable day in the sport's American history. So what does all of this really mean? Why does a motocross race from 46 years ago still matter? Here is what I keep coming back to. In a sport obsessed with factory budgets, engineering arms races, and corporate sponsorship dollars, one guy on a showroom floor motorcycle proved that the most expensive machine on the track is not always the fastest. Sometimes the difference between winning and losing has nothing to do with the price tag bolted to the frame. Sometimes it comes down to the rider who notices the starting pad is slippery, grabs a handful of dirt, and solves the problem himself because nobody else is going to do it for him. Every sport has these moments, the moments that remind you why talent, preparation, and sheer willpower still matter more than the size of your budget. But very few of those moments are this clean, this dramatic, and this well documented. Marty Moates did not have a factory behind him. He did not have magnesium engine cases or titanium fasteners or a team of engineers optimizing his suspension settings in real time. He had a production Yamaha YZ465 from the local dealership, a tiny team called LOP that believed in him, and the home crowd at a track he had been dreaming about since he was a kid, watching from behind the fence. And on June 22, 1980, that was more than enough to beat the entire world. If this story fired you up, hit subscribe for more motorcycle history that deserves way more attention than it gets.